Hi, and welcome to the Changing Perspectives podcast, a show where we discuss a variety of topics, including grief, parenting, health and wellness, and relationships. Join us and explore a number of changing perspectives. We're your hosts, Jenni and Josh Brennan. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 44. How are you, Jenni?
You usually say hi to me first.
Hi to you first.
Hi.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We are fast approaching episode 50.
Are we?
Well, this is 44.
Oh.
Yeah, 6 more episodes and we're at episode 50, which is absolutely crazy. So, I guess I wanted to sort of streamline our opening a little bit, and I forgot to say hi to you right after the opening. So hi to you.
That was a great metaphor for how our relationship is going these days.
Oh my goodness.
Just forget about me.
No way. I can never forget about you.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope everybody enjoyed our last episode. That was a quick pint-sized perspectives hanging out with my buddy Jacob. And I do have a couple corrections from that episode. We talked about football, which we've talked about on many episodes as being one of our family's favorite things just in general in life is football. And I had already revealed my favorite college team, which is Notre Dame. And then I, 5 minutes later, forgot that I did that and did this big reveal. So it must have sounded just silly to listeners. So I apologize for that. I just feel like, let's talk about it. Because I think it probably came off a little hokey. And I thought about, you give me that feedback that, Josh, you sound very radio shock jock, very radio voicey on that episode. Jocktober. That's a shout out.
Any
O&A fans. Very Jocktoberish.
Sorry.
That's okay. We can say hi to Lola. Lola never with us tonight.
Lola has never been with us in this studio.
I think she has.
When
we recorded the Avengers episode, she was here.
Oh, well, she doesn't know how. She's never been in here with Everett.
She'll settle.
Okay.
Focus, please. So I totally forgot what I was going to say. Oh, so I sounded very radio-y. So, and I wanted to tell you that I think I know why.
Why? Because
I made that episode category be kids and family parenting because I was just hanging out with Jacob. I was being a dad kind of, or I don't want to insult Jacob, but I was kind of using my preschool voice thing.
I've taught preschool with you. That's not your preschool voice.
No, what I'm saying is I think that I was dialing up the corniness because I was just hanging out with my 10-year-old.
You were never if you give a moose a muffin, he's gonna want some jam. You were never like that when you taught preschool.
Do you get what I'm trying to say, though? I think that's why I dialed up the corniness.
No, I don't think that's it. I don't buy it.
Well, that's what has come to mind.
False.
Okay, false. Anyway, so how are you?
I'm tired. I'm always tired. Recording at night is hard, but I did not share this with you. I got a shout out today about our podcast from a stranger.
From a stranger?
I know.
That's interesting.
One of my colleagues. So everyone that is in my office suite, we all rent space privately. So we don't work with each other. We just...
you reside in the same area.
Yeah. And I tend to book all of my clients back to back. I don't schedule myself a lunch or breaks.
Nope, you don't.
I schedule 5 to 10 minutes in between them, just long enough for me to do a little bit of charting, respond to emails, use the facilities, and maybe have a snack. So I don't really get to see my colleagues a lot, but on my way in this afternoon, because I start late on Tuesdays, because I work late on Tuesdays, one of my colleagues said, I listened to your pet loss episode to help me prepare for a session with a client today.
No kidding.
And then it just so happened that later in the day, one of my clients was late. And so I had my office door open and I was just sitting waiting for them to arrive. And a stranger walked up to my office and said, "Are you Jenni Brennan?" And I was like, crap. did I book a new patient and I forgot or something? What happened?
Yeah.
And I said, yes. And she said, I just want to say I love your podcast.
Are you serious?
Yeah. For a split second, I was like, oh no.
That's crazy.
Do we have stalkers now? Anyways, it turns out it was that colleague's client.
Oh, nice.
And so, my office door says Jenny. So,
yeah.
So I guess while she was waiting, she was reading the blog and the podcast and telling someone else in the waiting room about it. And she gave me a shout out about our content because she, works in a setting where the information, especially around grief and kind of children's mental health, is meaningful. So
that's really cool.
It was cool. It was cool to be reminded that people out there listen and that some of our stuff is useful.
That's awesome.
Also, I was thinking today.
Great news.
That I've had people that are now in my life because of the podcast. People who are really supportive. So
I know.
People that I wouldn't have been connected with. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but people that I would never have been connected with, that I'm connected with because of the podcast, who have been extremely supportive to me over the past week or so over some stuff. So I'm feeling really lucky. Well, useful, I guess.
No, I think that me too. And what comes to mind too, hope everybody's been enjoying the Get Burly commercial we've been playing for the ad. And that was just a pro bono thing we did for a friend. And they ended up using it on a video they posted. And we wouldn't have even done that. I wouldn't have had the knowledge to do that without the podcast. So that was cool. I hope sounds like everybody's enjoying our stuff, I guess, besides Corny Josh from episode 43. But
so I didn't listen to it. I had to shut the episode off.
So
maybe I can listen to it when I'm not so
What do we learn from that experience? Maybe you always have to be here.
Yes, but I did appreciate...
You were a substitute co-host.
I actually have to say thank you because you were chaperoning a date. Although, how were you chaperoning if you were in here recording?
They didn't know we were recording.
Oh, yeah. You were chaperoning a teenage date. And we got invited to go out and meet some friends. And you were like, you should go because we don't really both need to be home.
We really don't.
Chaperone, and we don't both need to be miserable at home.
Right.
Because chaperoning teenage dates is not... It's like watching being responsible for groups of teenagers is as if you were responsible for walking a herd of cats without leashes.
Yeah. Right. And totally chaperoning a co-ed get together, which we're about to do again in a few days.
Yeah, I'm busy that night.
Yeah. I guess are you going to get an invite to go out again?
That's highly unlikely.
But it's not fun. It's weird. There's such in this in between where you.
Yeah. Well, let's save it because we do have a teenage episode.
Oh, we do.
Coming
That's right.
up.
Hey, we're good at teasing content. By accident. Totally by accident.
Yeah, accidentally. Anyways,
so my whole point was
thank you for having me go. It's not often that I go out with our group of friends without you. So it felt a little weird. I also didn't have a car there because I was having some of the alcoholic beverages. So it was very weird. It was out of my comfort zone.
Yes. And the later
I had to order my own drinks. These are things you don't do.
But you have girls' nights and
I know, but I was the only one there that wasn't coupled.
Oh, that's interesting.
No, that's not true. That's not true. One of the other dads was there without his wife. I guess we were a couple for a little bit. Yeah,
makes sense with the two of you. What was I going to say? But you know what? I did enjoy doing that episode with Jacob. He had fun. We talked about one of our favorite subjects. But yeah, I'm gonna try to dial down the radio voice, and corniness a little bit.
Okay, great.
Moving forward. So Jenny, we vamped for just long enough, approximately 9.5 minutes. What are we talking about today? We're gonna throw it back to a good old fashioned CP podcast topic here. Go ahead. What are we gonna talk about?
We are talking about grief.
Back to a grief episode, but specifically we're going to talk about culture and grief. right?
Yes. So this has been on our list. I feel like I say this about every episode we do. I'm like, this has been on our list for a while, and I finally thought it was time for us to talk about it. And actually, it came up in conversation a few weeks ago. I was having brunch with some friends. I sound fancy when I say that. I was having brunch. And someone was telling a story about a situation where someone they know was talking about the recent death of a loved one and sort of elderly loved one, and offered to show my friend a picture of their loved one after post-mortem, kind of as they were laying there in the casket. And my friend was horrified. And I didn't jump into Professor Grief, Death and Dying Jenny Brennan then. I just was a friend and listened. But it got me thinking, because she said, I don't know if this is like a religious thing or a cultural thing.
Yeah.
And then I asked some more questions about their background, and I'm fairly confident that it's a little bit of both in this situation. But it really made me think that here in America, which is where we live, in New England, which has very strong sort of like Irish Catholic roots, taking pictures of a loved one after they've died,
Post-mortem.
yeah, is really kind of taboo.
Yeah.
But it's not taboo everywhere. And so it made me think, I think it's really time to sort of talk about culture and death and grief and dying and the differences there, so that people can really kind of broaden their perspectives a little bit on it. And I know, Josh, what you're looking at right now is you're looking at slides from a webinar I did that was really focused on organ and tissue donation and sort of cross-cultural variations in death and dying, specifically with regards to organ and tissue donation.
And we talked about that. I don't know
that I'm really going to go off of those notes, but I know you like to have notes in front of you.
And it's going to drive questions I ask during this episode. But I wanted to shout out our myths about organ and tissue donation, because we did talk about religious preferences when it comes to that end-of-life decision.
Okay. I don't remember doing that.
Yeah, we did. We mentioned it. But basically, we can just sort of mention briefly that variations or attitudes and feelings and interpretation about organ and tissue donation for cultures and religions vary greatly. Generally speaking, all the major religions of the world do support in some way organ and tissue donation. But, those don't always match up with the cultural patterns and attitudes about grief and death and loss. Which is really what we're going to talk about today, right?
Yes, I think we're just going to listen to Lola scratching. Everybody
yes.
I was actually looking to see.
Doggies
that was episode 6, myths about organ and tissue donation.
On.
Very early on.
Early on.
Yeah, so I'm going to be painting with a very broad brush here as I'm talking about cultures and
otherwise
religions.
We'd be on the air for like 4 hours.
Yeah,
episode.
but I think it can be helpful to consider culture and religion as one component when we're trying to understand how someone approaches death, dying, and grief. There are lots of other factors that influence how one looks at death, dying, and grief. Culture is one of those. It doesn't mean that if you are if you are an Asian American, that you are absolutely going to approach death the way I'm going to talk about. But it means that culturally, on the whole, there is a strong tendency towards a particular sort of approach. And I think it's important to kind of pause and zoom back and look at that. One of my favorite courses to teach is a 14-week course on death and dying, sort of cross-culturally. And I always start out talking about the Turajan people.
Yes.
Because they don't believe that death occurs in their loved one until their loved one has been able to have a proper send-off. And in order to have a proper send-off, sometimes you have to be able to save up money and resources for years. And so until then, the loved one's body remains in your home. It's sort of crudely, and I don't mean crude in a negative way, but sort of crudely preserved, and they are offered 3 meals a day. They are referred to as being ill. They come to family parties. They come to village gatherings. They are in photographs, and it's not until that they finally have their big sort of festival and send-off that they are considered dead. So I always start with that to sort of get students a little bit horrified, because it's horrifying, especially if you are Irish Catholic roots, to think about, oh my gosh, grandpa dies and then we preserve him and we feed him we offer him food 3 times a day, and we bring him to parties and take pictures of his decomposing body, and we treat him as if he is alive. That sounds like a horror movie. But when you really start to kind of think about it, it says a lot about, it's really beautiful.
Well, I wanted to, one of the things I wanted to start off with was the Roman Catholic faith, Irish Catholic. But
because that's our history.
Yeah. And then I wanted to talk about how it influences, like this religious background significantly influences secular tradition. But I love that you started with the Tarasians, and it made me think about that very cool documentary series on Netflix. Remember you just came home and I was watching it and you're like, whoa, those are the Tarasians. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? And we had this great conversation about it. And it's called The Dark Tourist. It came out in 2018 on Netflix.
I haven't watched it though.
It's
that was not video that I would use in my courses, but
no,
same.
it's basically this journalist, David, I don't remember his last name. Basically, there's I think 8 or 9 episodes, and he goes to these destinations across the globe that are sort of off the beaten path, focuses sort of on the dark side of society. That's
a pretty negative term.
Well, like the underbelly sort of like for instance, he goes to he does this tour of Dallas. It's where they learn about Jeffrey Dahmer, and there's this tour, or that's Milwaukee, I'm sorry. So he goes to Milwaukee and learns about Jeffrey Dahmer. There's a tour of the locations of Dahmer's murders. There's a tour.
Why are we talking about this?
Hold on, I'm getting there. There's a tour you can take at night in Dallas, about the assassination of JFK, and he does all these different things. One of the places he goes to is the Tarasians in Southeast Asia, right? Mm-hmm.
Indonesia.
And he goes through learning all about that culture. Now, that sort of perpetuates the perspective of that being, negative or dark or something different.
Yeah, because that's always my approach in a course like that, is not to like point fingers and be like, ooh, look at that. Isn't that so exotic and cool?
Right.
But to really kind of demystify it and really to flip it so that by the end of the semester, when you look at sort of our more traditional funerary practices here in America and our grieving practices, which on the whole are, don't talk about the dead, pretend you have closure, get over it, move on, and pump them full of chemicals and then bury them in the ground. Mm-hmm. So that by the end of the semester, you get to that point and you're like, actually, maybe our cultural approaches are the ones that seem pretty kind of foreign and over the top and dark. That was always my intent, was to not sort of showcase them as like, look at these crazy people. Because really, so many of their practices, and we could spend a whole episode talking about cultures all over the world that sort of believe in burying themselves when they're still alive,
right,
so that their villagers don't ever see them actually die, or people that still practice. Wow. Sorry, I thought Lola was peeing on our rug. Villages that still practice cannibalism and believe you're sort of, boy, when we record at night, I have no word recall. That part of my brain shuts off.
It's all good. Lean into it, Jenny.
Villages that believe that in order for ancestors' spirits to live on in their loved ones and their families that they leave behind, that they actually have to be fully consumed. So all of the liquid remains, all of the bodily remains, that's illegal in that vast amounts of the world. However, it still happens. So, when you really start to kind of look at that, you understand those aren't savage acts.
No.
The people and the Tarajans aren't doing that because they're poor. They're approaching death, dying, and grief because of their love for their loved one and their willingness to want to remember them and incorporate them into their life. And when you compare their grief after the death of a loved one to our grief here in America and sort of more Western traditional practices, we struggle a whole lot more with grief.
Right. Absolutely. So
I think maybe we're doing some things wrong.
Yeah.
That maybe being so quiet about grief and death is not actually so good. And I because we've moved into fall, I've taken on more new clients. And so I've been doing a lot of initial sessions over the past couple weeks, and of course have a lot of grief clients coming to me. And it's as if a light bulb turns on for them when I give them permission and tell them that what they're feeling is normal. Because they all come in with this expectation that they should be having closure, that they should be over the loss of their loved one, that they shouldn't want to talk about them, that they shouldn't want to hold on to their possessions. Someone was telling me recently that they want to make a blanket, a quilt out of their loved one's t-shirts. And I think that's beautiful.
That's awesome.
But their friends are saying, that's pretty morbid. That's just going to make you remember them. You need to forget about them. You need to move on.
Oh, man.
And when I said to them, I think that's a wonderful idea. Imagine how good that would feel to wrap yourself up in a blanket of his t-shirts.
Wow.
It was like I was the first person that was giving them my permission to do that.
That's too bad.
But that's how our grief is here in America. And it is rooted in sort of our cultural history.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about how it looks different, and if something looks different in a different culture, we look at it and go, okay, that's wrong.
Right.
But it's not. Like I'm just looking at the Wikipedia. No, it's Wikipedia. But I just clicked on a link to going back to the Indonesia, the Tarajans, and it talks about how very often there's elaborate dancing and music.
Oh, yeah. It's a festival.
Yeah. And that's so different from what we're used to, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong or weird.
Right.
It just means that it's different. I'll shout this out at the end, but if you're interested, you guys can check out the Dark Tourist series on Netflix. I think it's episode 6 that details the Tarajans. It is a TV MA. It's tends to be pretty explicit. They don't leave anything to the imagination. They show, real things. It's not for kids, but it's a good series.
Maybe it's for our kids.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things that, we traveled the world.
So we did a semester at sea, and boy, do I wish I knew then that I would be doing grief work, because I would have, in every country, I would have leaned into, I would have focused on grief and funeral stuff. And I didn't see any of that.
Well, do you remember Hiroshima?
Of course I remember Hiroshima.
And those amazing women that we met.
The women that were there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Grieving.
Yes.
They were grieving, and I'm sort of putting it together as we're sitting here talking about it. But we saw in Japan, so I don't know, have we talked about this on episodes? We must have. But you and I had the very fortunate experience to travel the world together for a semester abroad around through a program called Semester at Sea.
That is where we met Get Burley.
Yeah,
the Get Burley founder,
our buddy Mikey. Mm-hmm. And so one of the countries we visited was Japan. We had a chance to actually drive to Hiroshima and visit those sites, and we happened to just come across these two elderly women, mother and a daughter, right?
I thought they were sisters.
Oh, sisters. One was in a wheelchair, and they were there paying, honoring in memoriam and grieving loved ones.
Right.
that they lost.
So when you look at the Asian culture, there's a heavy emphasis on respect and your elders. And
Right.
it is your job to pay respect to your elders. And it is your duty to visit their memorials. It is your duty to have little shrines of them in your home. You know, they're in Japan, they're kind of running out of space for burials. And so they're becoming very innovative. I mean, they're a very innovative country when it comes to technology. So they're building these like high-rise buildings that house your cremains of your loved ones. And they have these sort of ceremonial rooms where you punch in your loved ones like digits, like whatever their ID code is, and it sort of is like one of those bank machines that sends you the little bucket that you put your like check deposit in, and it sends it through the tubes. I don't know what those are called.
People still use those?
Well,
we bank on our phones.
I don't. Yeah, there are people that actually go to banks.
Wow.
I assume that they still use those.
What are those called?
But that's what I think
those
of.
Pneumatic tubes.
Yeah. Anyways, they do that with their cremains so that it sends it to the shrine that you're in, and you and your loved ones can honor your dead elder. And then when you're done, you can kind of send it back and they'll store it for you.
Okay.
But they have these whole businesses around it because that is what you do. It is so important when you lose a loved one in that culture to continue to pay respect and honor them and pray to them and pray for them. And you want to make sure that their soul and their spirit remains happy so that they can bless you with happiness. And if something is going wrong in your life, it might be because you're not doing a good enough job honoring them. So that cultural belief is so strong that here they are building high rises just to sort of support that function. And we still see that. We see that tendency here in America with Asian Americans too. You know, they tend to, again, this is where I'm painting with a very broad brush. But they tend to, as a cultural group, approach death with a real sense of dignity. They're not people that you're going to see really outwardly grieving with their emotions, often because they feel like that would upset the spirit of their loved one.
Right.
And so they're very reserved. But that doesn't mean they're not grieving. It doesn't mean they're not honoring them. It doesn't mean that they forget about their loved one. It means that they very much are just doing it in their own way.
Now, is that, so you mentioned just painting the broad brush of the Asian culture in general, and Asian obviously is this gigantic umbrella term, but
lots and lots of different religions within
but
there.
I want to talk specifically about, because you, in your notes that you share with me from the slides from your presentation, that webinar you did, you specifically talk about Buddhist and Shintoism, and do those religions, or some of the characteristics that you just mentioned tie into those religions, or are they a little different?
No, I think they're sort of elements of that in many of the religions that are sort of woven in the Asian culture. Did you have a pointed question for me?
No, I'm just looking at the Shinto faith, which a couple of the bullet points you have
really
here.
Nature.
Yeah, they're surprising. It says the dead body is considered to be impure, dangerous, and powerful.
Yeah, I mean, so this is why, I can't remember what we've talked about before, but this is why the Japanese culture really struggles with the concept of donation.
Yeah, you had mentioned this
organ
before.
donation and tissue donation, because the body should remain sort of intact, and you don't want to disrupt the body. You don't want to disrupt the spirit. You don't want to touch the body. I know when I've worked in children's hospitals before, sadly, I've been there in the room when children die. And I remember one young child who'd spent really their entire life in a PICU. And when life support was being withdrawn, the directive from the family was that no one was to touch the body. Because touching the body would make it impure and would not allow the child's spirit to move on, and would trap the child here. So there's really strong
powerful
connections to the body. Some areas in Japan still do a very traditional ceremonial, like bathing ceremony of the body, where the family members actually bathe the body. in a very ceremonial way where there's sort of two buckets of water, a warm bucket and a cold bucket, and you can't sort of commingle that because the body is really kind of impure and needs to be cleaned. But it's a really loving act, and I think for a lot of grievers, really healing to be able to do that.
I do have another point about the Shinto faith, just from your slide deck, but also there are many cultures that do a post-mortem bathe, right?
So many.
Yeah, and Islamic,
and
right? Too.
So pretty much everything except for like traditional Irish
Okay.
Catholic believes
Which
in,
I want to talk about after
like
the break.
the Latino culture really places a heavy emphasis primarily on the women
Interesting.
dressing the body.
Okay.
So when like a hospice families, when the nurse comes to do the pronouncement and then the funeral home comes to do the removal of the body, the women in the family request often that they dress their loved one, that they sort of clean up their loved one and dress them before they send them off with the funeral home. Often also happens in African American cultures as well. This real sort of strong connection to the body and this belief that like we should take care of it one more time. It comes up a lot for me in my sessions with clients because it's their tendency, it's their desire. You know, when I was talking about it today, they wanted to, their loved one, circumstances were that their loved one's body, that loved one died in their home unexpectedly. And they just wanted to go in that room and see their loved one again one more time. But, you know, the sort of first responders didn't think it was a good idea and wouldn't let them. And so the next time they saw and touched the body again was after it had been prepared. And that's a huge regret for them because they didn't get to, and the body was right there, but it didn't happen because our sort of, you know, traditional air quotes here, traditions here in North New England are like, no one wants to see the body. No one wants to really touch the body. And so these people, these wonderful people, the first responders, the funeral home workers, they're thinking that they're protecting the loved ones, but really they're taking away what in so many cultures, so many religions is this sort of intrinsic desire to just be with that body. They're taking that away.
Well, they're taking away the
opportunity
ability
to make that
grieve,
decision.
to grieve in the way that fits them, right? Yeah. Wow, I think it's time for a break.
Okay.
Yeah. So stay right there, everybody. We will be right back. Are you looking to level up in life with your health, mindset, and personal mission statement? Are you a coach of a sports team or leader of an organization looking to build critical leadership skills for your team? If so, then look no further than GetBurley.com. The Get Burley brand offers life coaching, personal fitness programming, and team building retreats, clinics, and seminars, all designed to empower individuals and teams to become the best versions of themselves. The Get Burley Team Building and Leadership Development Division works specifically with athletic teams, corporate groups, and educational institutions. Through their signature seminars, workshops, and/or retreats, Get Burley will have your team firing on all cylinders and working as an inspired, cohesive unit, committed to the mission and vision of your program or organization. Get Burley will build the inner strength necessary for you and your team to gain clarity around your mission, input strategies to enhance mindfulness, amplify personal accountability and ownership, and much, much more. Do yourself and your team a favor and visit GetBurley.com. Get Burley. Be the best version of you. All right, we are back. Jenny, so before the break, we were sort of reviewing, the Asian culture. We talked a little bit about different things, similarities, like the act of bathing the body, which is pretty much prevalent throughout the world, except in the Northeast, right? I would say the U.S. in general, right? Very, very broad generalization. We, again, disclaimer, we're sort of painting everything with a broad brush, but
no, I don't think it is. I don't think that's I think that there's a good portion of the U.S. that has strong Native American cultural ties.
Okay.
I think
Yep.
there's a strong portion of the U.S. that has African American Black ties, where homegoings, the Everett's here,
Everett's here.
the concept of homegoings, and sort of, the New Orleans sort of parties and festivals after a loved one dies. I think it's a little bit, I don't want to sound like Trump here. I think it's a little bit like mainstream media's approach.
Yeah.
That's what we see. We kind of see what we're seeing here in the Northeast,
Well, I think
but that's not
that's
how it
interesting.
goes everywhere.
So I think that what we see from where we're from is what we see, I think, in movies and television, right?
Well, and think about where my understanding is that here in the U.S., there's a lot of films and movies that are made here in the Northeast, New York, Boston, sort of these like metropolitan areas.
Well, and it's, and the people writing the screenplays, they write from their experiences, and their experiences are clearly in a lot of these movies.
Well, not just their experiences, but they don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Like nobody wants to actually, talk about grief.
Right.
When someone dies in a movie, we don't often get to see their grieving process. So,
right.
I think it's kind of about a notion around that. Are you getting distracted by dogs?
Yeah.
Why?
Everett's trying to share Lola's blanket, which is not very big.
Oh, and she won't let him.
Yeah.
That's why he looks
Well, I don't
sad.
think she even realizes he's trying to do it. So.
I don't think they can settle without blankets in
I know.
here.
We got to bring blankets for the next episode. Let's dive into the Roman Catholic faith, because, I think what started out as I mentioned this before. Wow.
That was Everett's
Tails on the guitar. What started out as very strong religious ties into funeral and death care planning with regards to the Catholic Church, or even offshoots of Christianity, such as like Lutheran Church or whatnot, probably very similar, have become what we recognize as the secular way to handle a death. Right? So there's a wake, and where the body's embalmed, and you come to the funeral and you wait in line to do like the receiving line to meet the grieving family. You go around and you kneel at the casket and you do the sign of the sign of the cross. But maybe you haven't been to church in 10 years, or maybe you've never been to church, but you feel like you do need to because that's what everybody else is doing. So you kneel at the coffin, the casket, and you do the sign of the cross, and you bow your head, and maybe you say something that's special to you, or a little prayer or whatever, and then you go and sit for a little while. Maybe you leave, don't spend there too long, and then the funeral itself is very similar, where it's very ceremonial but quiet, not a lot of talking. Everybody has to dress in black, and so that's the cookie cutter sort of thing we see all over the place. And I think
I think that's your experience. I don't think that's what we see all over the place.
I meant in this region.
Okay.
That's what I meant.
But not even in this region. There's a pretty heavy Jewish population here.
Okay.
Where then the tradition is that you sit Shiva, where actually there is a pretty big focus on the family's grief, because the family's not supposed to be doing anything. They're supposed to be cared for. For a period of 7 days, they're not working. So I think that's just been your experience here, because
But again, though, I think that's what we see in
not
movies.
Exactly diverse.
What I just described, we see in movies all the time, television shows. I can think of like 5 movies right off the top of my head where there's
do it.
There's like a funeral scene.
Do it.
Right. Well, Friends.
Who does what? Oh, Phoebe
and Monica with the catering thing. I want to say. The Sixth Sense. What else? Pretty much every time somebody retells the Batman story.
That's true.
There's the funeral where they find Alfred talks to little Bruce after his parents' death. I mean, this is what we see all the time. So I guess my question to you is,
I'm trying
does
to
it
caution
come
you from saying this is what we. I want your painting. You're using a little bit of You're using a little bit of your experience here.
It's informing what I'm saying.
Yeah. I want you to acknowledge that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. That this is not.
But I wanted to talk about why
these are the movies that you choose to see.
Okay. Fair enough.
So if someone else was sitting here, someone with a different cultural, a different religious background, those might not be the movies and TV shows that they watch. And so perhaps what they're seeing is, the Day of the Dead in Latino Mexican culture, or maybe they're seeing homegoings where the funerals are not these sad, somber events with everyone wearing black, but they're parties where people are wearing bright Caribbean colors and are telling stories about their loved one.
Right.
And perhaps they're fainting and shrieking and wailing, but they're also laughing and praising God and having fun. So I just want you to acknowledge that I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge that what we bring to the table is really informed by our experiences. And we have to be careful to not generalize, which is what you kind of were just doing.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And understand that that's been your experience, partially because that's been your family's experience, but also because you've chosen for that to be your experience, because those are the types of movies and television shows and friends that you've surrounded yourself with.
Well, that's why you're here. That's why you're the expert. That's why we decided to have this episode.
And none of it is, well, I was going to say none of it's more right than the other, but I actually would say that I think the Roman Catholic way, when we're looking at grief and sort of outcomes of the grievers, that it is the worst way when it comes to grief.
Yeah, I guess that's definitely what I feel. But I guess I wanted to go back to, and my original thought and point was, does the secular way of handling a death, is that related to, are there roots in the Roman Catholic methods?
That is a good question. I think their roots are in multiple places. I think that certainly over the years, the sort of Catholic Church has passed down sort of edicts on how death should be handled. And certainly the Bible, which is sort of the authority for that religion, gives some guidance over death and the body.
Right.
I think it's more based in like really sort of social growth. Because what happened in the 1800s, around the 1800s here and in like the UK, is we started to, to sort of walk you through, way, way, way back when, death wasn't a big deal. Someone died, regardless of sort of culture, regardless of religion, there would be a death, wasn't really a big deal. And I'm talking about like way back in like humankind's history. People were born, people die, no big deal. Let's just dispose of the body, no big deal. And then people started to become a little bit scared of the body because they were connecting it to some illnesses. And so there was this push to get rid of the body because it was viewed as impure and was going to make them ill.
Right.
And then there was
going to be the source of whatever illness it was.
Yeah. And then over time, there became sort of an infatuation. It was sort of like the pendulum swings, as it does with most things socially, swings, way far to one side and then way far to the other side, and then kind of course corrects. So then at some point, we also, as a culture, sort of globally, I'm talking sort of globally on the whole here, became really infatuated with the dead body. Things like wanting to save lockets of hair, do imprints or masks of the face, take photographs of the dead body. Right. And then from that, we started to become really kind of afraid of the spirit. And so this is where a lot of things like superstitions came from, was around kind of our fear of the dead body because of the spirit itself. And so I think all of that also impacts how we traditionally approach death and dying today.
Right. Okay.
What are you looking at that makes you not look at me when I'm talking?
Well, I'm actually I was monitoring your microphone as you were talking. Yeah.
It's like allergy season, and so I think I said this a few episodes ago. The longer I talk, the froggier I get.
Yes.
And the more likely I am to break into
right.
to wheeze and to start coughing.
Well, we forgive you. That's okay. So I wanted to go back to the idea that, culture dictates sort of or can dictate the,
Can influence.
Influence. Yes. The memorialization, the memorials, right? How do you memorialize? Am I saying that? Is that a word?
I don't know where you're going. So let's figure out where you're going, and I'll tell you if you got here the right way.
Right. How you honor the decedent after death, right? Like a couple of these things, specifically the Roman Catholic faith. You had said here in your slides, there's a 1 month anniversary celebrated by a mass.
Yeah.
Right.
Why are you focusing on the Roman Catholic? You have like 36 pages in front of you.
No, that's just what I started with. There's
okay.
40, like the Shinto religion said, they don't even consider someone as actually dead for 49 days after death. And I feel like, do you think that affects the family's ability to grieve properly? Thinking that this person doesn't actually die for 49 days. I mean, that's a long period of time. And then there's all kinds of they know.
Well, a lot of cultures and religions believe some sort of iteration like that. Like a lot of Native American cultures believe that there's different kind of levels to life. And so your physical death is really just your ending of life here on earth, and you sort of move to another plane. A lot of cultures also feel like, all right, my loved one's body, there's two deaths. There's a physical death, and then there's sort of spiritual death, where their spirit finally kind of moves on to the other realm. Some cultures and religions consider the actual death at the time that the body stops working. Others, more than I would say the majority, actually feel like the time of death is not when the heart stops beating or they take their last breath, but it's when their spirit fully moves on. And the sort of rules around that are different from culture to culture, religion to religion, and often are sort of hinged upon the requirements that are put on the families, the grievers. There's things they have to do. There's, to kind of bring it back to the brunch I was talking about. It sounds like Lola.
What is going on over there?
Lola is trying to make this piece of paper her blanket.
Oh my goodness!
She's not so bright.
She may have lost her podcast privileges.
I want to go on record as saying Lola can't be in here.
Yeah, she needs to.
She can't settle.
Yeah, I think we need to trade her out with Norma Jean for as far as a pit bull.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So to tie it back to what I was sort of starting this with the brunch, the person, the family, the person was talking about really has their roots based pretty heavily in almost Amish traditions, almost sort of puritanical traditions, which is sort of another element of our New England roots here, is the puritanical belief where, it's not a big deal to take a picture of their loved one. Life and death is really kind of black and white. And so there's a wide variation. Lola has completely thrown me off because I'm so afraid she's going to pee on my rug until she settles. So, sorry.
Derailed your thought process.
Completely.
It's okay.
Sorry.
You're still making very valid points.
I feel like
you're very coherent.
Just feel like I wasn't, but
it's
hopefully
coming across great.
That made sense.
It's okay. So, I think there's many differences, obviously, with the different cultures across the world.
Well, and within our own country here, for those of you that are listening in America, and for those of you that are even living locally, whose experiences may have been like Josh's. I feel like I've had more experiences because of my training and my education. I've had more exposure to different cultures. So when someone sits across from a table at me and says, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they were just talking on and on about their loved one and what they looked like when they actually died, and that they took pictures of them, that we have to sort of be able to step back and say, okay, where does that come from? It doesn't mean that they're wrong or that they're crude or that they didn't love their loved one. Perhaps that's based in their cultural belief.
Well,
perhaps that's how they look at death and dying and grief. Perhaps it's a very kind of different approach than what I've had in my life. And that doesn't make it wrong. It doesn't make my way right or wrong. It just means that it's different. And I really think it's very interesting when you open yourself up to hear about these other traditions. And I'm always genuinely curious when I sit across from a client or a friend or someone that I'm talking to about death and dying. I'm really genuinely curious to hear what their sort of approaches were in a death. You know, I don't say, hey, I'm Jenny, tell me about a recent loss and how your family approached it. But if they're talking about something and it comes up, I think it's interesting to hear. Yeah. You know, I think we're seeing some new things when it comes to children and children dying. And I say this because the town that I drove through tonight to get home, the funeral home there is flying. Did you see this on Facebook? They're flying 2 flags out front. They're flying a purple flag and an orange flag because they are waking and doing the funeral for a little girl. And those were her 2 favorite colors, purple and orange. And I thought that was really wonderful because the family has requested that it be a celebration of her life, not the traditional, which you would see at that particular funeral home, not the traditional, like, quiet, somber, everyone dress in black, the body's at the front of the room, pay your respects.
Right.
Leave.
Yeah, and that, again, I think going to your point, that process doesn't always lend itself to being like an open door to welcome grief, to welcome, we talk about how grieving families, part of their grief journey involves wanting to talk about their loved one. Mm-hmm. And that's just one of those things. It's like, well, you're not supposed to talk during the wake, or, you sort of sit there quietly. And changing the perspective into a celebration, I think could be really helpful for people.
Well, and it is something that so many cultures do. Every culture, every religion has something that they do with the body after death. And
I was just going to say the disposition of remains is one of the elements that changes depending on which culture you're in.
Right. So, but every culture has some sort of disposition of remains. That's the sort of final step there, which is what they do with the body, whether it's a cremation or a burial or any of that with embalming first, or a green burial or a sky burial, or a burial at sea, or cannibalism. There's a whole host of things, but every religion, every culture has something that they do with the body. They also have something that they do with the body immediately upon death. Many cultures believe that you should never leave the body alone from the point of death until that final disposition of the body. Someone in the family has to stay with that body at all times. Many, many cultures have that belief. And so if you are in one of those cultures and you look at kind of our family's sort of heritage and you say, oh no, the body dies and some stranger comes and picks it up and puts it in their car and brings it to their kind of sterile environment, and it sits there in kind of a morgue environment for like 2 or 3 nights, and then we go back and see it. That sounds pretty horrifying.
It absolutely does.
So when you find yourself feeling a little bit like, ew, when you're hearing about other cultures, I hope you can remember that there's a wide range of approaches here. None of them are right. None of them are wrong. And maybe we can learn something from each other. Because maybe the way that you've done it, maybe the way your family has done it, if that doesn't feel like it's working for you, you don't have to do it that way.
Right.
You don't have to. you can go to your funeral director, the next time you're planning a funeral for a loved one and say, I don't want to do it this way. I heard about this, concept of a homegoing where basically it's a party and it's a celebration of my loved one's life and there's music and I want to do that. How can I make that happen? Or my kids' favorite colors are purple and orange. How can we incorporate this and make it really, truly a celebration and not this somber, heartbreaking event? Or I'm really not comfortable with embalming. What are my other options here? So you don't have to keep doing what you've been doing either.
Quick shout out to the great interview, our first interview ever. What episode was that?
I can look.
Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, we
so you'll have to give me
interviewed
30 seconds.
Yeah. We interviewed a funeral professional, death care specialist.
It's About Funeral Directors was episode 13.
That one, but also our interview.
Oh, right. I thought that was, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's a good one.
Progressive Funeral Care, interview with the modern mortician.
The modern mortician.
That was episode 18.
That was a great episode as well. She talked a lot about some of the differences in, green burials and what people can do with the disposition of the body now, and the different trends, how the trends are changing a little bit. Before we end this episode, real quick, I wanted to talk about the differences specifically with maybe what grief looks like in these different cultures. And I wanted to talk for a second and start this discussion off by talking about the Jewish faith. And you had mentioned this a little while ago, sitting Shiva. Mm-hmm. And that's 7 days after the burial. Mm-hmm. That's like a sort of not force, but like a invitation to just, think about
and talk about
the person who
and
died.
have people show up.
I love that.
Right?
That's really great.
Because if you look at our sort of traditional Irish Catholic roots here for you and I, it's, person dies, everyone shows up in the days between the death and the wake, bringing casseroles and telling stories about the loved one and helping get like photo boards and slideshows put together. Then everyone goes to the wake and then the funeral. And then there's this like repast, the gathering where people are not really crying, but not really being happy either. And then everyone goes home. And by then you've used up your 3 days of bereavement leave from work if you work at a place that has bereavement. So you probably go back to work the next day, maybe 2 or 3 days later. Whereas if we're looking at the Jewish faith, you've still got 7 days after that where you are given permission to sit and grieve your loved one. And really, you're still in shock at that point. So when you're not allowing time to pass, you're winding up going back into your regular sort of day-to-day living, still in shock, not aware of what's going on.
Yeah. Even for those, known deaths, like those anticipatory grief,
right.
People that knew that they were going to die, it's still, for the grieving family, still a shock factor.
Sure.
Their grief journey doesn't change just because the fact that
no, and research shows that you don't grieve less. If you have a loss where you're allowed the opportunity to have some anticipatory grief, your loved one's on hospice, they're going to die. Your grief, it's not like you get that grief out of the way ahead of time.
Right.
The research shows that you still grieve just the same as everyone else. It doesn't sort of slow your process or anything like that. Yeah,
and my guess is that's the same for just people in general, if you're human, regardless of what culture you're from. But do you have anything else to add about the differences with culture when it comes to how different cultures grieve specifically?
I will say that in many other cultures, really everything except for white, like Anglo-Saxon and Asians, there's a strong sort of permission to grieve really outwardly and openly. Wailing, pulling your hair, fainting, falling on the ground, throwing yourself on a casket, none of that is crazy. None of that means that like, oh, that person doesn't have their stuff together. They're really weak. It means like in so many cultures and religions, that's what you do when your heart is ripped out of your body and you've lost someone that you love, is that you show it, and you show it very actively, and you show it very loudly, and then you talk about them a lot. You remember them. You keep their memory alive.
Right.
And so I think that's an important thing to remember, because when you do come from a background like we've come from, and then you witness a different funeral method for the first time, it can be unsettling, because the message that you receive, you and I have received through our sort of childhood, is that showing your emotion is somehow wrong.
There's such a negative connotation with it, especially when it comes to a funeral or just grieving in general. I
have a lot of people that come to me and say they didn't cry a lot because they were trying to stay strong for someone.
Yeah. That concept has come up a lot in many of our episodes when we discuss grief. That grief doesn't end, and there's no closure.
Yeah, closure is a myth.
Yeah, and
there's no getting over it either.
And I think that's true probably in multiple cultures. All right, Jenny. Well, that pretty much takes us to about an hour on this episode. Do you have anything else to add about culture and grief and death in different cultures?
This is just sort of the tip of the iceberg here. I think we could talk about this every single week.
Right.
But I'd love to hear from people as they're listening to the episode, share their traditions, their sort of cultural, their religious traditions around death, dying, and grief.
Okay. All right. Well, that is going to do it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. You can learn more on this just by checking out jennybrendan.com and clicking around Jenny's website for different resources. Also wanted to invite people to check out that Netflix series called The Dark Tourist. That was a cool documentary series. Everybody, please follow us on Facebook at Changing Perspectives Podcast and on Instagram at Changing Perspectives Blog. You can send us an email to changingpodcast@gmail.com. You can also visit us on our website by going to changingperspectivesblog.com. And while you're there, don't forget to check out and visit the shop to see all that great Changing Perspectives merchandise. Go ahead and subscribe to the show, everybody, so you'll never miss an episode, and we will see you next time. Say bye, Jenny.
Bye, Jenny.
The Changing Perspectives podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by Dizzy Bird Studios. Please visit Dizzy Bird Studios on Facebook, facebook.com/DizzyBirdStudios.